Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to this wonderful lecture session from the horror program at the University of the Underground. I'm Aggie Haynes. I'm head of the horror program, which is a critical exploration into illicit societal fears and human passion for horror. We're going to be investigating institutions and popular culture through the lens of the horror genre in dramaturgy, film, costume making, and more. The University of the Underground is a free, pluralistic, and transnational university that was founded in 2017 and birthed in the basements of nightlife venues. So we're a non-profit, we're a registered charity. If you'd like to donate, please visit universityoftheunderground.org, and on this website you can find other exciting programming times and events, and you can find other things online on our Instagram. So this is going to be an absolutely awesome one today. We've got Anna Bogutskaya with us, who's a film programmer, writer, creative producer, and broadcaster. In the past, she's worked at Pedro Almodovar's Deseo and was the film and events programmer at the BFI, where she curated many seasons and created the Woman with a Movie Camera Summit. As a writer, she's contributed to Sight and Sound, Little White Lies, BFI, Tortoise, The Guardian, NME, ID, amongst other outlets, and is currently working on her first book. So as a broadcaster, she's a regular contributor to Kermode and Mayo's Film Review, The Arts Hour, Women's Hour, Newsnight, and others. So she produces and hosts The Final Girls, The Next Supremes, Hello, Sidney, Censor This podcasts, and as well as being a contributor to many others, she also regularly hosts panels, Q&As, and delivers talks on film, festivals, podcasts, and is the festival director of Underwire Festival, which I'm sure you all know of, a co-founder of horror film collective, The Final Girls, of which we have many fans of here. So Anna, we're super pleased to have you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure, and also thank you so much in advance. And I apologize for the extreme nicheness of the thing that I'm going to talk about, but I'm very pleased to have been given the space to indulge my obsession with a very particular subgenre of horror and why I think it's relevant. So I'm hopefully, the way I was thinking about this, I'll talk for about 25 minutes. I'll give a little bit of an overview of the final goals and the sort of work that I do, especially in the podcast space, because that's where I've mostly been creating for the past 2 years. And then I'll go into my presentation about dance horror, and at the end we can have a chat about either some of the ideas that I raised there or any of the other stuff that I do or have done, or horror culture or horror cinema in general, which is very much in flux. So bear with me while I share my screen with you guys. Before I get into the actual presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that I do. And thank you so much, Aggie, for giving an overview of the stuff. Mainly what I've been doing in the film and the horror space. I've been working as a writer, as a film programmer. Previously, I was at the BFI, but the project that I guess is most relevant for this session is my work with the Final Girls, which is a collective that I co-founded with my friend Olivia Howe in 2016. And for the lifespan of the Final Girls, we did a lot of events, a lot of curatorial work, up and down the country, touring programs, special events, midnight screenings, all-nighters, archive screenings, short screenings. We did kind of small-scale distribution. We supported new releases. We recovered forgotten titles. We collaborated with a whole bunch of festivals around the UK and internationally, and we gave a lot of talks. And all of it was centered around the intersections of horror film and feminism. And when I say feminism, I do it in a kind of very loose basis. We're never really interested in branding one particular film or one particular genre as feminist or unfeminist. It was more about creating an inclusive space for people who might have not been welcomed in horror spaces before, and also to provide an entry point and to support and shine a light on women who might have been forgotten in horror history or were not really part of the horror conversation. And it is a space that has been, until quite recently, mostly dominated by, let's call them gently, horror bros. So in the second lifespan of the Final Girls, mostly because of the pandemic, it has revolved around the creation of the Final Girls podcast. We continue doing events sporadically. They are much more difficult to produce, and then the very idea of film events have now kind of evolved into a different space. So shortly before the pandemic started, in one of our last kind of big curatorial project was about the figure of the witch, and as part of that, we did a season of screenings at the Prince Charles and at the Horse Hospital in Bloomsbury. Did a symposium with conversations with academics and guest speakers that ranged from writers to programmers to academics specialized in the history of witchcraft, and also launched the Final Girls podcast with our first season on witches. Since then, we're currently on our fourth season, and it's a weekly podcast, and alongside usual coverage around new releases and interviews with filmmakers, specifically looking at female filmmakers, but also female authors of horror. We are looking at subgenres and tropes. So the first figure that I explored for the podcast was the witch, then followed a season on the female monster, and then was vampires, and we're currently now midway through the teen horror season. Now, obviously, there is a lot of attention paid to female creators and kind of other marginalized voices throughout horror, and as a question of well, as a choice that I made from the very inception of the podcast, all of my guests on the show are either female or non-binary identifying. So as alongside that, over the last 2 years, that's what you'll see on the left is kind of the logo for the current season of the Final Girls podcast. Then what I started creating a lot more of this year is more shows. I've been fascinated with the podcast space for over a decade, and in the last couple of years started inching my way into that territory. First, doing on-air stuff. I co-presented the Bigger Picture, which was the BFI podcast, which then Final Girls podcast. Taught myself very roughly how to produce and actually make a podcast, and probably the first episodes sound terrible, and I really don't want to go back to listen to them right now, but learn how to make them and how to carry a show. And then over the last actually 18 months or so, I've been also alongside that producing other shows, some of them commissioned, some of them in partnership or sponsored by companies or organizations, and some of them entirely because I wanted to. So one of the things I've also been inspired by a critic and podcaster friend of mine who's based in the US, Jordan Crucchiola, is to create single film podcasts. So I've done 2 of those in the past 12 months. One of them was Promising Young Podcast, which was a 5-part show entirely dedicated to discussing Promising Young Women, the Emerald Fennell film that came out in mid-2021. And it's a deep dive into all the thematic aspects of the film, completely uncensored, very, very long, and the sort of criticism that I always wanted to indulge in, or the sort of criticism that I wanted to participate in, one that is not limited by very small word counts, one that is bigger than a review, and one where you can actually have a back and forth of ideas about a film that generates conversation. And Promising Young Woman was probably one of the most antagonizing and interesting films that came out in the last year. I've also done this in partnership with the official distributor of Censor, which is the Prana Bailey Bond debut feature, which premiered at Sundance in 2021 and then came to UK cinemas at the end of last year as well, was Censor This. And it was a different format, but similar but different. It was much more, it was half scripted, half discussion based, very sound designed and highly produced, with almost complete access to all the elements of the film. So essentially it was a love letter and a discussion of Censor. It included interviews with Prano, with a lot of her key collaborators, the actors, the production, not the production design, but the costume designer, makeup designer, composer. It included snippets from the film, the original soundtrack, as kind of a backdrop to it. So this is a similar premise, but an entirely different scale of production. And just up until this Monday of this week, I was also co-producing with my friend Mike Bunser and and supported by Paramount, a limited series podcast called Hello Sidney, which was looking back at all of the Screen films in advance of the new Screen film coming out, which came out last Friday. That was very much a discussion-based also podcast, but with original interviews with the key and the new cast, and also with clips and music from the film. And that's much more oriented towards horror fans. It's much more lives between the critical and the editorial space in a way. We were not hindered in any way editorially, but we were being given access and supported by the distributor of the Scream films. So that's me. And I'll just briefly mention my writing work tends to not only focus on horror. I write about a lot of things. I'm writing currently about the Britney Spears film Crosswords. So, you know, there is range in the things that I cover. But what I'm really, really excited to talk about today is about dance horror. So this is something that it's a subgenre that I very flippantly probably came up with while appearing on a podcast talking about the Luca Guadagnino 2018 film Suspiria. It was on the Evolution of Horror podcast. This was in 2018. And since then, I've been manically and quite desperately trying to get anyone to give me the space to talk and explore this genre and why I think it's emerged in the last couple of years, and really especially since the pandemic crystallized into something completely new. So thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to do that, Aggie. So the combination of these things, right, is quite curious. So on the one hand, we've got horror, which for me has always been a genre of the body, as in it's a full body experience, both for the characters on screen and for the audiences. There's bodies that are contorted, that are possessed, slashed, that are burned and assaulted, killed in all manner of creative and ingenious ways, and torn apart and reinvented for our viewing displeasure. But also in terms of what happens to us as the audience, is the anxiety, it's the nervousness, it's the fear, it's the anticipation of seeing something grotesque, it's the empathetic feeling of almost feeling it happen to ourselves as we watch it happen to the characters on screen. And so detractors of the horror genre, and this occurs very much in all film spaces, you know, in the programmatic space and the critical space, will often dismiss horror as something considered low art or as a lesser genre, as a parallel industry almost that operates on its own rules, has its own star system, its own conventions and tropes, its own very dedicated audience and following, and can sort of manage itself and should not be allowed in with the big art house boys or into the awards conversation, because it's not high art, it's not quality, it's not, quote, you know, so to speak, cinema with a capital C. So on the other hand, we have the idea of dance, which is the opposite. It's the idea of high art, it's elegance, it's beauty, it's poise, it's strength, it's dedication, it's elitism. We're talking about kind of an elevated art form, elitist spaces that are extremely expensive, that require a lot of dedication and training to be able to achieve those heights. And horror, well, horror is the lowest form of shock value and degradation. This is considered the complete opposite. So I've always been obsessed with both, and on a personal level and on a professional level with horror as well. And I've always considered dancers to be these fascinating, really frightening creatures because of the obsessive and dedication that their craft requires. They're athletes in my mind, and also because they have a very limited, not lifespan, but the body has a limit as to how much they can push themselves and perform at their highest levels. So a lot of that training goes on when they're extremely young, and the peaks of their performance often are reached when they're extremely young as well. So this is a quote from Vaslav Nijinsky, who was a very influential Russian, or should I say Soviet, ballet dancer, and led a very intense and very dramatic life, and caused a lot of sensation with his dancing in the early 20th century. So for some, and when I say some, I mean mostly me, when I thought about dance, I always thought about this intersection of extreme beauty and extreme pain, because of that amount of strenuous, lifelong, obsessive dedication and training that dancers, especially ballet dancers, have to undergo, and how it transforms their bodies. They look slightly different. Sometimes it's people who are in continuous, have to manage their bodies in a way to avoid being in continuous pain. And even the most beautiful of dances are essentially extreme body horror in many ways. So their bodies become both tools of beauty and horror. And those are both genres, both the dance one and the horror one are genres of the body. And there is something that not me, but the writer and director Julia Ducournau mentioned in an interview I did with her for the Final Ghost podcast earlier this year. Her film Titan, which won the Palme d'Or last year at the Cannes Film Festival, is not strictly what I would consider a body horror, a dance horror, sorry, but it does have a few choice dance scenes. And when I asked her about those, she mentioned this idea of body empathy. She also had a lifelong fascination with dance, always went to the opera and is fascinated by dancers and dance as an art form. And she mentioned this thing, how about body empathy being about dance scenes and dancing on screen being used by her specifically as a filmmaker to get the audience to feel for her characters through the body and through their body. So connecting us empathetically with the characters through what their bodies are experiencing on screen. And it is completely immediate, it's completely instant, and it goes above the notion of language. So for me, dance horror is the epitome of that. And it's the perfect coalescence of the horrific and the beautiful in a sense. So when I'm going to talk about dance horror, I am not going to be talking about dance scenes in horror films. I'm not going to be talking about, the 3-minute disco dancing scene that Jamie Lee Curtis does in Prom Night, with no disrespect to her. It's a beautiful moment. But what I'm talking about is this relationship between the dancing and the horrific and how it crystallizes in the body, and what are some of the elements of it and how they manifest in this tiny subgenre of maybe 15 films and a few music videos and a few episodes of TV shows. So let's start with the obvious. A lot of these films center on dancers or center on dance troupes or on the dynamics that exist within professional dance, within the business of dancing itself. So the earliest that I could find is the 1931 pre-code horror thriller, The Mad Genius, with a fantastic tagline that you can see in the trailer for this film. He's a mad genius, but he's a genius. And the genius in question is played by John Barrymore, and he is this Svengali-like figure who makes a lot of promises to a young female dancer to make her the best dancer ever. There's also Spectre of the Rose, which is an adaptation of an actual ballet piece, became a 1946 film noir film centered around a male ballet dancer, which is quite rare, who is suspected of murdering his first ballerina wife and trying to plot the murder of his second ballerina love interest. It's essentially a dark romance, but they're using the element of dance to create that tension, to visualize that tension. But the first real important film, it's not even strictly a horror film, although I like to think about it that way, is Powell and Pressburger's 1948 ballet romance drama, The Red Shoes. So it follows Victoria Page, who's played by Moira Shearer, an actual professional dancer, a ballerina who joins a world-renowned dance company and has her dedication tested through having to choose between her love interest or her craft. And her craft and her love interest are represented in the film by two very different men. And at the end, and I'm sorry to spoil it, but it is a film from 1948 and we kind of have to talk about it, she commits suicide because she's unable to choose between being the best ballerina she can be or having a life, essentially. So what's important to note about The Red Shoes is that it introduces a point of view shot. And I tried to find a clip or a gif of it and I wasn't able to, but you can definitely recommend watching this film. It's essentially, we see as she is dancing, we see the stage and the audience from her point of view. And this shot will become eponymous in horror films in particular, even in Michael Powell's own Peeping Tom, which was a very early slasher from 1960, most famously in John Carpenter's Halloween in 1978, you see this point of view which puts you into the actual body of the killer, or in this case the dancer, and will be reused further on in other dance horror films, specifically in Black Swan. So The other key one is Suspiria from 1977 by Giallo master Dario Argento. Now, actually, there is not that much dancing in this Suspiria, so I won't spend too much time talking about it, but it is important to note that the Suspiria that I will spend a lot of time talking about from 2018 is a loose reimagining remake of this one, which is centered on a dance school that is actually a cover-up for a coven of witches, but there's actually no dancing in Suspiria. In the 70s one, there's very little. Nobody in the cast knew how to actually dance, so they sort of do some pliés really awkwardly and then move on from there. But it is a phenomenal film that prioritizes mood over plot or logic. So then one of the things that I found very compelling, and obviously tackles a lot of my own professional interests around horror, is this obsession with female ambition and obsessiveness and madness. Very often the characters, with the exception of the Spectre of the Rose, which I mentioned, are women, and they're usually artists. And even if they're not, they share this obsessive nature, this madness, this idea that they will be driven into disrepute or into losing themselves, trying to achieve a sense of perfection, whether that's in their craft, whether that's dancing, usually dancing in dance horror, or whether it's being consumed by their own emotions. So I wanted to just mention briefly Possession, which is Andrzej Jaworski's horror drama, which really is, I think, one of the best films about divorce next to Marriage Story, but it also involves a Lovecraftian fuck monster and a lot of very strange, loosely connected scenes. The plot is extremely thin, but it essentially centers on the breaking down of a relationship between a spy played by Sam Neill and his wife played by Isabella Gianni, who you see in the throes of a really disturbing, really manic episode, which is, I think, one of the best scenes of dance horror in a film that actually isn't about dancing at all. And her character increasingly starts showing unhinged behavior and very mysterious and kind of very unquantifiable ways. And the centerpiece of the film is this prolonged scene in an underground corridor where she thrashes around in this kind of demonic dance, seemingly completely out of control, completely out of herself. It's one of the most stunning pieces of cinema that I've ever seen, a dance or horror or otherwise. It completely possessed. So I'd like to move on to one of the key titles of dance horror, which is Darren Aronofsky 2010 Black Swan, which centers on a ballerina, centers on the tensions that exist within a ballet company, and centers on a very obsessive and increasingly unhinged female protagonist. So the protagonist, for anyone who's not seen it, is Nina. She's played by Natalie Portman. She's a ballerina in the New York City ballet company. She is obsessed with being perfect. She's obsessed with being the best, and she wants to play the lead role in a production of Swan Lake, which demands her to be both playing the white swan and the black swan. And she is told that she is too pure and too technical to play the more demanding and explosive part of the Black Swan. So Nina is constantly, even before she gets the role, overwhelmed with the pressure that she finds herself, of the situation that she finds herself, of the competition, the demands on her body, the demands of her abrasive mother, the demands on the competition between her colleagues at the dance company, the head of the dance company. So it causes her to lose her already strenuous grip on reality and kind of start descending into madness. She starts seeing visions of herself as a double in her everyday life, and as she's dancing, she sees herself as a manifestation of this darker side of herself, of a black swan version of herself, something that she wants to be able to perform, but at a personal cost. And it's also clearly a manifestation of her own insecurities and this obsessive perfectionism that's already in her. And at the end, when she, again, sorry for spoilers for a film from 12 years ago, but at the end, as often these characters do in these films, Nina dies, and she dies performing on stage. So as she stabs herself, thinking that she is stabbing the Black Swan, this evil doppelganger that is following her around. But even as she dies, she ultimately is content. Her last words in the film are, "It was perfect," after she stabs herself, because she delivers such a great performance that her death in her eyes is justified and even earned. So within these films, especially when they center actual professional dancers at the center of them, it's always a lose-lose for the characters. They are tortured physically, they're tortured emotionally, and often end up dead at the end. And it's a kind of a win-win for us as an audience, because we get the grotesquerie of horror cinema, we get the existential dread, and we get the beauty of seeing professional and talented dancers perform. So as I mentioned at the start, kind of the dance horror genre is a genre of the body, and one of the things that kind of flows through all of these films is this idea of the body out of control. So the dancer as a figure is an athlete, and they're in complete control of their bodies to an extent that would require decades of training, whereas I can barely touch my own toes. So dance horror has a compulsive quality to it. The mood when their bodies are out of control, they're these hyper trained machines that are suddenly let loose, and there's a compulsiveness to it. You know, their bodies are suddenly moving out of their own volition, almost propulsed by some unhinged or even supernatural energy. And in the horror genre, these obviously remind us of demonic possession. So I want to talk about the film Climax by Gaspar Noé from 2018. The first half of that film, about 45 minutes of those, before the credits even come onto the screen, is a whole dance sequence. And the second half of that film, almost neatly parted, is a deranged horror sequence. So Noé cast both professional and amateur dancers from very different disciplines into this film, dancers that come from different styles of dancing as well. So a lot of street dancers that come up that he discovered through YouTube, dancers who practice voguing or whacking or crump, dancers with different body types. And the first 45 minutes of the film I just set to this techno remix of Supernature and choreographed by Nina McKeely in only a few days, which fits in very well with the unhinged energy of this film too. And Noé was always, even as he said in interviews, was hypnotized by watching dancers, and always a very big fan of nightlife, looking at it through a different lens. So it is an extreme film, and we're coming back to kind of to the horrifying aspect of Climax. After the dancers in this film accidentally all consume and are spiked with a dose of LSD, it all descends into an out of control and out of body frenzy. So it's about 20 bad acid trips all happening simultaneously, like a demonic mashup between the devils and Step Up. The dancers are also isolated in their rehearsal studio in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of a snowstorm as well. And as their hallucinations start to kick in, reality starts slipping out of focus. The studio becomes a nightmarish continuation of weird rooms and corridors, which fits in visually with Noé's previous work. You know, sometimes you'll look into one room and there'll be someone cutting their face off, and maybe there'll be someone having sex. You'll never know. And Noé and his cinematographer just kind of use the camera as this almost possessed bird's eye view take on what's going on. And at the center of all of this, again, is the dancer's body. Some of them are still dancing, completely unhinged, completely high off their faces. And then what was so beautiful in the first half of Climax suddenly becomes so horrifying, because they're no longer in control of their limbs or of what they're doing. This is not a routine anymore. So there's a fabulous quote from the New York Times about this film, which is about this range of emotions, this body empathy that a dancer's body can convey without ever actually saying anything, often without the director even scripting this. It's this perfect amalgamation of what the performer, and especially a performer used to performing with their body as opposed to their face or with dialogue, can bring into the screen and into the genre. And in my interview with him, when the film came out, I spoke to him for Sight and Sound, and he mentioned that this was very much a film, not so much about substance abuse in particular, or you know, a lot of people have interpreted it as that, but for him it was wider and it's more about losing control. And I think this losing of control applies very specifically to dancers who are very tightly wound and choreographed. You know, every movement is accounted for. There is also a contagious element. There's a contagious loss of control in dance horror, which again taps into this fascination with the pleasures of the body horror that we love to watch, and is a whole widely written about subgenre of horror cinema, and the aesthetic pleasures of seeing these performers move their bodies in a way that a lot of us just will simply never be able to. So back to Suspiria. In the same year as Climax came out, Luca Guadagnino's reimagining of the 1977 Suspiria comes out too. And this has the very bare bones same elements as the 1977 film. It is also set in a dance school. Now it is transplanted to Berlin from Italy. And there is much more plot involved. So it is the ballet school, the dance school is now modern dance as opposed to ballet. It is also again a front for a coven of witches, and here we get this trifecta of dance horror elements together. We get women obsessed with perfection, with artistic perfection. We get the grotesquerie and the sensual power of dancers, and we get this climactic, completely unhinged dance sequence that echoes a demonic possession, or a summoning or a witch's ritual. So Suspiria tackles these familiar themes of female ambition, of ruthlessness, of power, and also the power of the dancer's body. They're isolated again from everyone else and consumed both physically and emotionally completely by the dance that they're rehearsing and by the competition between them. So the Coven of Witches sometimes will grant some of their preferred young dancers special powers in order to make them better dancers. So the performances are literally worth every single sacrifice, their lives, their bodies, their souls. And the witches in Luca Guadagnino's Suspiria actually speak mostly through movement and also practice their witchcraft and their violence through movement. This is one of the most viscerally grotesque scenes in the film that's used. I'm just going to play a short gift to remind you what it's like. But this in this scene we see a cross-cutting of a beautiful modern dance performance, which completely mimics this absolute deranged breaking of bones of a fellow dancer in the coven. So we're literally getting, on in split screen but in cross-cutting, the simultaneous grotesque decimation and devastation of a body versus what a performer can do with their movement when they're performing their piece. So there is this all-consuming, all-encompassing power to dance that is at the center of these two films that came out in the same year, and of all the previous dance horror films that I sort of mentioned before. So there's unstoppable and compulsive and involuntary dancing is an actual real thing. It's known as choreomania, and it's appeared several times throughout history, which is a real kind of form of dance horror. And I'd just like to mention a few of them. One of the most fascinating real life cases of choreomania is the dancing plague of 1518, which began in July of that year and lasted until September in the city of Strasbourg, when a woman started randomly dancing on the street, and then that spread to other townspeople, and eventually, and accounts differ, but it's said that over 400 people were manically and uncontrollably dancing on the streets of Strasbourg. Now, up until a lot of them, I've read in different accounts. The most general one seems to be that around 100 people actually died from exhaustion from dancing too much. Now, the accuracy of how many people actually died is kind of a mystery. The reason for this plague is also a mystery, but historians have attempted to explain why the plague happened through reason of demonic possession, about overheated blood, contaminated bread that had a fungal disease which caused convulsions, a mass psychogenic disorder, a tribute to a pagan god, a tribute to the patron saint of epileptic dancers and entertainers, Saint Vinus. Basically, nobody knows to this day, but it wasn't the only dancing plague of its kind. It's just the most well-known and most widely documented one, because a lot of the authorities of Strasbourg at the time were making official documents and notes, and they tried to curb the plague by making dancing a mandate. So they made the dancers go on dancing day and night, constructed a special little stage for them so that they could move freely around, and even hired professional musicians and other dancers to keep them going. I mean, that was not a good idea. And it seemed that it kind of spread the contagion. And then without any other particular reason, it just blew over and disappeared. Before Strasbourg in 1374, there was another outbreak of dancing plagues around Germany and France, where thousands of people were supposed to be dancing in agony involuntarily for days or weeks, and were screaming and having terrible visions and imploring priests to exorcise them and save their souls. So this was only decades after the Black Death, and the Strasbourg outbreak connected to the second plague epidemic as well. So jumping forward to our current pandemic and epidemic, in 2020, the filmmaker Jonathan Glazer, who's most well known for making Under the Skin with Scarlett Johansson, made the BBC dance horror short Strasbourg 1518, obviously directly inspired by the dancing plague, and tapping into something that's actually been on my mind for the duration of the pandemic. Of course, since we weren't able to go anywhere and we were confined in our homes, and venues and public places, clubs and dance floors were banned and closed, Glazer's film was shot during lockdown with a choreography designed for individual dancers by himself in collaboration with Art Angel and Sellers Wells, and is scored with this thumping electro pulsating score by Mika Levy, a frequent collaborator of his. And these dancers are all compulsively moving, but they're moving by themselves in isolation in separate rooms. So there's nothing more dance horror-y than the idea of being on a dance floor in the middle of a pandemic. So the very idea of being on a crowded dance floor in the middle of COVID, for instance, seemed the very idea to me of going onto a death dance floor, like the final scene in Roger Corman's The Mask of the Red Death from 1964, which is a loose adaptation of an Edgar Allan Poe story, where in the final scene, there was a grand ball, and actual death, which is the creature pictured there, is going around the dance, tapping people on the shoulder, and they turn red at his touch, meaning that they are taken by death. And this is, I thought a lot about dancing and dance floors while I was during all of the lockdowns. And ironically, although I missed dancing and clubs and the dance floor, I did end up getting COVID on the dance floor. So go figure. But I wanted to really finalize this by bringing up one of the most mainstream and popular masters of horror of our time, Mr. Stephen King, who in his 1981 book of nonfiction essays, actually aptly titled Danse Macabre, really recommend the essays. They're all about the nature of horror, both as audiences, as fans, and as in his case, storytellers. He classifies 3 different levels of horror. He talks about terror, which is this creeping feeling of dread. It's the unknowable. It's the thing that you cannot see. It's the atmospheric buildup. It's the knowing that there's something scary that might happen, but not knowing what it could possibly be. Then there's horror, which is when you come face to face with something, you come to face with a monster, with a threat. It's a shock value, and it's scary because of that. And then there's the revulsion moment. It's more primal, it's gross out, it's shock value, it's the cheapest form of horror. It's the blood and guts of it all. And dance horror, I think, as a subgenre or as an aesthetic, or perhaps just as a personal obsession, I haven't decided yet, I think encompasses all 3 of these levels. Because there's the terror of not knowing why or how these bodies are moving in these ways. There's the horror and the shock of the contortion of the body, and there's the revulsion that their demise and their transformation provokes in us. So that is my spiel about dance horror. So thank you very much for indulging me.
Thank you so much. It's so fascinating. I'm sure there are a lot of questions from the students, but one thing I wanted to know, and it's something that actually came up in the chat a little bit on the side. Is this something that's also seen in like music videos? Ludwika mentioned one, and I'm wondering if, you know, I'm just thinking about people like Chris Cunningham and Roger Barlin, who's like directed a lot of different horror-esque music videos. Is that something that you think spans into music video direction as well?
Yeah. Oh, totally. I mean, you can even, I didn't even bring it up because I wanted to, otherwise it'd be too expansive, but absolutely Chris Cunningham, and then even something like Thriller, Michael Jackson's music video, that's essentially zombies dancing. And yeah, absolutely. And obviously I think that there's also a ton of, not a ton, but some short films that come to mind. Glazer's obviously is very high profile because of who he is, but I've seen a number of short films that explore the body or kind of I would see as dance horror, that are using kind of movement and dance and professional dancers in horrific settings in a fascinating way. And what's interesting as well is a lot of these films tend to be quite quiet. The older one, so the 1940s one, because it's still Hollywood conventions and you still need to have like a conventional or sort of conventional script, although the Red Shoes is transformational in so many ways, not least because it has, I think, a 17-minute ballet dance sequence in the middle of the film. A lot of these films are not very chatty. They don't really talk that much, or the dialogue is completely improvised or kind of besides the point, or a very, very loose plot. Guadagnino's Suspiria is very verbose, but also doesn't necessarily make that much sense plot-wise. It is more, the sense is made and the characters really breathe when they are moving as opposed to talking, I think.
Thank you. Has anyone else got any questions for Anna?
Yes, hi Anna. Thank you for your presentation. It was really interesting. I was wondering if you experience yourself with your own body dancing horror, or and maybe in clubs actually, or.
Well, I was thinking a lot of this about because of COVID, because of being stuck at home and kind of missing the dance floor. And it kind of became a source of a lot of fear, really, because the idea of being on a dance floor and even kind of rubbing shoulders with people became terrifying. It's like, well, what if, you know, just we're breathing the same air, we're touching each other, and all of that seemed synonymous with contagion. And I was thinking a lot about the Roger Corman thing, because there is that literal scene where he kills people just through touching them on the shoulder in a dance sequence. And I mean, that's the closest thing personally that I've experienced. It just kept coming back to me because of how paranoia during the pandemic has connected us all in a way, and because of this idea of the dance floor suddenly becoming a place of real danger instead of a place of release. So it became a place of horror and of terror instead of a place of fun.
Okay. Are you familiar with the work of Bogomir Doringer? Maybe.
No, who's that?
Is an artist designer, and he worked around dancing in clubs, how it is really linked to like ritualistic dance, and it's super interesting.
Oh, great. Can you put it in the chat?
Yeah, I will.
Yeah, thanks, Pauline.
Awesome, thank you.
Oh, awesome. Wonderful. Anyone else? Well, maybe whilst everyone's thinking, sorry, Anna, I have loads of questions for you, but I was thinking, like, it made me think a bit of, you know, Vivian Sobchak in the Carnal Thoughts book, and she talks about watching a film and she feels it in her fingers and says, like, why am I watching this film with my fingers? And I always think that that's really interesting. And I was just wondering, because you mentioned that, you know, maybe it alters the casting for these sorts of films. Like, I know in a lot of horror films, in fact, we had a talk last Friday where someone mentioned a lot of people who'd starred in adult films also starred in a lot of horror films and things. And I'm wondering whether, you know, well, whether it will change the face of acting more if this is something that becomes more recognizable, that like,
I think it goes on a film by film, on a case by case basis, really. Because some performers might be very right for one film and absolutely the wrong ones for another one. But I do find it interesting because it's a very distinct choice depending on the filmmaker. So if you look at CLIMAX and SUSPIRIA is mostly professional actors who learn how to dance, and obviously will be limited because you can't learn to be a professional dancer in 3 months. These are people who train for years, decades. Versus, you know, how do you get a professional dancer who is not an actor necessarily to learn how to act to a level, you know, they might learn for that particular role, but they might not continue doing it. It might not be the way for them to express it themselves. So I don't think it will necessarily be an industrial wave in any sense, because people casting is constantly in evolution and people kind of cast based on what the film needs in that way. But I do find the combination quite interesting because CLIMAX is mostly professional dancers or amateur dancers and one professional actress, Sofia Boutella, who is also in her previous career was a professional dancer. So she kind of comes from both worlds, but she was the only one. The rest of them were dancers, and some of them had continued to act, most of them have not. But that is also depending on the director and the energy that they want to give the film.
Yeah, no, it's so fascinating. And can I perhaps ask a question about your previous work? So as part of this course, one of the outputs of the course is to create a podcast. So obviously, like, your work is quite influential, I think, to what everyone might think about producing. One thing I was going to ask is, do you have any hints or like tips of like what good ways of firstly structuring podcasts or engaging people in them, and then secondly, you know, how do you get into making podcasts in the first place?
By structuring, do you mean by engaging, do you mean engaging people to listen, or by getting people to participate?
Well both.
So let's answer the other way around. How do you get into podcasting? I have no idea. I just started making them. There are courses and things like that. It's a new booming industry. I think the UK is behind by maybe a year from the States, but there are now kind of schemes and things like that to get people to make podcasts, but it's also a thing that you can make literally in your bedroom. So the barrier to entry is very, very low. The main thing is always editing more than anything else. Then going back to your first question, how to structure it, or any hints, I think that entirely depends on the project. Every podcast is a snowflake. They all have their reason for existing. They might be conversational. There might be sound art. There might be field recordings. They might be sound designed. They might be very short. They might be 3 hours long. It really, really depends on what the project is. So I think, I listen to podcasts that are pure criticism and conversation. I listen to podcasts that I would consider kind of sound art or audio poems. There's podcasts that are fictional, that are narrative, that are completely immersive, that you listen to and it feels like there's sound coming from behind your head, and things that I listen to despite being like very clearly recorded in someone's garden shed or car. It kind of varies on what the identity of it is. So if I come up with it sets the expectation. So if I come up with a project, it's like, I want to make a horror podcast, I want to make a horror story, then you're thinking about a fictional story. You're thinking about narration, you're thinking about sound effects, about sound design, about the layering of the sound, about how it comes into the listener's ears. Does it all go through one ear, through both of them? Can you do a 360 thing? Kind of the experience that you want to create is entirely different. If you're doing a horror podcast that's criticism, it's like, okay, is it a mono one? Is it just one voice? Is it, for example, I could do a whole podcast about that's just an adaptation of what I've written here, with clips, with music, and that could just be me speaking, mainly because I can't convince anyone to talk to me about dance horror for longer than 20 minutes, but also because it's been in my mind and maybe that's the way that I visualize this. I can also, you can also do a horror podcast that's a conversation, a round table, two people, audiences, whatnot, and that might just be very simple audio of just recording a conversation, putting it out as is without any additional shenanigans or any additional sound design. It kind of depends on the thing that you want to make and the expectation that you set. So if I say that I'm going to make an immersive horror ghost story, and I just record something on my laptop as is now, that's going to be a bit shit because my expectation is going to be deflated. If I just say I'm going to have a conversation about this really interesting aspect of horror filmmaking or horror criticism or horror culture or body horror or so, whatever it is, then you're coming for the conversation. The audio quality or the design of it or the flow of it is entirely in the words. It's in the words. It's not in the actual production itself, if that makes sense. I think kind of in my own work too, the most interesting perhaps comparisons would be the mini pod. So the one about Promising a Woman, Promising a Podcast, and the one about Censor This. Because Censor This, if you've listened to it, or if you listen to it, it starts off as a scripted visual sound design, not visual, sound designed entry point into this film, and then it's critique, then it's exploration. And the Promising Young Podcast one is literally, boom, we've started, we're going to talk about this, and it's a free-flowing, I mean, not free-flowing, it was structured, but it was structured in a way that makes you not notice the structure. It's a conversation between three people. There's no clips, there's barely any music. The entirety of it was recorded over Zoom in a couple of weeks, and it's barely got any editing because the point of it was the conversation about the film. And it was diving deep into certain topics about how it was covered and so on. So the expectation is different and the proposition is different, and they demand different things from you.
That's so interesting that as well, that almost is like a type of dance horror. Your whole body's involved in hearing the podcast as well. Anyway, I think that's really interesting for all our students here. Ludwika, sorry, do you have a question?
First thing, I mean, that was a wonderful presentation. I would have so many questions. It's just like a chaotic flow, and I cannot just pick one. So thank you. It was amazing. So about like this podcast thing, because we're going to do a podcast for the program. You probably already know it. So I have a specific question that is, do you think that the podcast has to like take just one of the categories you mentioned, or that is it like possible to, I don't know, mix them somehow? So for example, just saying mixing the fictional and the conversational part of the podcast into something, if that's like kamikaze for like someone that doesn't have already use with the tool. And also like side note, if we could possibly like have your contact and maybe even like eventually get in touch with you for like feedback or something when we have a structure or a sample or something like that, because that would be amazing. Love your work. Thank you.
Sure. To answer your question, yes, absolutely. Feel free to share. I'll share my contact in the chat afterwards. But to come back to your first question, the simple answer is there are no rules. There really are not. Like there is, you can listen to WTF with Mark Maron. That has its own structure, its own vibe, and it's successful because of what it is. Then you listen to an NPR podcast or anyone who's come out of the NPR structure. They have a style of presenting, of the style of journalism, as well as style of podcasting, which has been massively influential. Obviously, everything stems from Ira Glass. It's like the granddaddy of podcasting, but you can see that style. But then you look at people like Karina Longworth, who just did something that she wanted to do because she's never heard of it before. And I don't think you can do anything that will necessarily by design fail, because there is no blueprint until you create the blueprint. So it's going to sound extremely pretentious, but sometimes when I've made a podcast, I will not know how it should flow until I literally hear it in my head, and then I know exactly what it is, and then it's a question of finessing it to get to that point. And that's either working with the editor or when I'm working with it myself. My editing skills are limited, so I can do certain things, but up above a certain level, I love working with sound designers and audio editors. But the playing around with the sound is actually a place where you can really figure that out. You can figure out, even if, you know, you don't have to worry about the technical bits until later when it comes actually time to finesse it and mix it all, but you can start playing around with how things layer on top of each other to help you figure out that flow and that structure, because you can fit it in. I think the basics are very important to decide up front. So like, what do you want from it? Do you want it to be an entire conversation? Do you want it to be very much like a collage approach? Do you want it to be sound design? Do you want to have music? Do you want it to have space that you allow, so kind of silences and a different rhythm to it? And then play around with those bits and see what sounds right, because when you listen back to interviews, when you listen to specific sounds, if you're scripting something and you read it out loud, that sounds really silly, but actually scripting something for, say, a presentation, or scripting something for a podcast is entirely, or even having a conversation like this or an interview is entirely different proposition. So sounds really stupid, but this is a real thing, a real kind of a tip. Script it out and then read it out loud to yourself. Read it out loud in different inflections, you know, read it in your natural voice, read it improvising jokes if it's, you know, if it's a fun one or whatever. Read it in a kind of more dramatic, you know, serious way. See what feels right for the subject, for what you're trying to say. And then also I would always suggest kind of play around recording yourself in those different ways. Because then when you hear it back, you know, sometimes things will just click. You'd be like, oh, I see the tone that I need to strike with this. If you're presenting, you know, if someone else is presenting, then you can also tell them exactly what it is that you're looking for, by essentially knowing what it is, knowing how it's supposed to sound. So I've done that a few times with different projects, because, you know, for instance, with the Final Girls podcast, if you listen, the trailer is usually just me talking about what it is that the season will cover. And I remember for the second one, the female monsters one, it was very much a kind of a very intense kind of, yes, this is going to be an exploration of everything we think that woman, like monstrous womanhood and how we're afraid of women. And I remember sending it to my colleague Olivia, and she laughed at me. She was like, what is this? This is extremely intense. But then, you know, you kind of do something with teen horror, because teen horror is fun. It's about teenagers. It's about remembering your own teenage years. It's about watching really kind of shitty 90s and 2000s films, but also loving them and appreciating them. So the tone has to be totally different. So this is kind of I don't think it's contradictory, though it might sound contradictory at the start, but you kind of have to find the way that you want to speak and the way that you want to communicate as you make it, because you kind of need to hear it especially if you're making a first one, kind of need to hear it in your head, and then you'll know what you need to reach for. It's the same as, like, you know, if you draw or if you write, you see the thing in your head, and then it's a question of translating the thing that you see and trying to get there. And very often it will just be terrible, and then it'll be a little less terrible, and it'll be a little less terrible, and then you just have to kind of keep going until the thing that's you've made is the most similar that it can be to the thing that's in your head, the way that you see it. So I think with podcasting, especially when you're trying to be more creative around it, when you're trying to be more sound designing, more layered, less so with interviews, because it's much more about you getting stuff out from someone else as opposed to necessarily you talking or you scripting. With the things that are coming from you, it's so much about you trying to get to the thing that you sort of hear in your head and to try to hear it clearly.
Well, Anna, thank you so much. I think this is amazingly valuable like insights. I really super appreciate it. Before you disappear, can you tell us what you're working on now so that we know what to look for next?
So I'm continuing to put out the Final Girls podcast. We just put out an episode today about Battle Royale. So that's going to be going on till June. So it's the teen horror season started in September, and it's going to be going on till June, because I like the joke of starting it with a school year and running the season as much as, you know, doing it like an academic year. I've since regretted that because it means 80 films to cover. So I'm doing that. I'm regularly writing for different places. I'm just finishing my book, but that won't be out for a while yet. And I'm always around on other people's podcasts and doing my own. So I do the Final Girls podcast. I've just finished the Hello Sidney podcast. I'm doing the Next Supremes podcast, which is a recap show with my friend Clarice Lockery, who's another film critic, about American Horror Story. I'm working on a couple new shows that I can't talk about yet, but hopefully are both podcast all podcast form or audio form, but not necessarily horror centric, which would be fun. And hopefully, yeah, maybe I'll convince myself to make a dance horror podcast, since no one except you will let me talk about it.
Yeah, do it. Oh, well, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. It was such an awesome talk. Thanks, Anna.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been a blast.